Hey there, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Intersection of Success and Spirituality podcast. And I am thrilled because this is the first ever episode we actually film in celebration of episode 100, celebrating 100 episodes. So we want to do something special. And in order to really flip the script, every single week we have a guest. The goal of the show is to help high performers and achievers with their spiritual and inner life. And I was really thinking, as I look at my philosophy of interviewing, I really believe that the best interviewers are those that present themselves as friends. And I said, what better thing than to have two friends actually interview me? So today we're flipping the script, we're flipping the tables, and I've got two amazing people I truly admire and appreciate. The first one, his name is Mark. His name is Mark Neely. He's a great friend. He's I've known him for some years, and time again, what really moved me is that he's somebody that, as I spend time with, he's just so attentive, and I think in life he's just one of those people that just gets me. So I'm like, we need to do something together. I told him someday we need to write a book someday together, like, because we just like, there's just a genuine connection, and also a great beloved friend. Her name's Karol. She's somebody that I admire, her whole family. They're doing amazing things, and known her for a few years, been able to do some great things as well. And both of them in different capacities have done some amazing things for the kingdom of God and impacting their community. So I'm like, why not do something? So I'm so excited, so honored. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks
for having us. We're really excited.
Yeah.
This is great. Josh, this is a huge milestone. 100 episodes of success, the intersection of success and spirituality. It's a big deal. So when you look back at these episodes and experiences that you've had this far, what have you learned about yourself?
I think I've learned that if you really put your mind to it, you have the capacity to actually grow. And the thing is that I think one of the things that really strikes me is that early on, the very first person I ever interviewed in my life was actually when I was 15 years old. And at the age of 15, I remember during that time, I was part of a Hispanic youth ministry here in LA. And we had this annual conference where we would have something like 2,000 youth show up from all over Southern California, sometimes from different states. And during that time, I was freelance writing. And I told my youth pastor at the time, I'm like, hey, in order to promote this conference, I'd love to interview you. And so I remember the very first interview I ever did was with my youth pastor. And years down the road, I'm in a new season, I'm in a new place, and I remember that I was moving from, I guess, more of a traditional way of doing ministry, and I'm looking more towards something new, and I'm with my youth pastor, and I ask him the question, hey, in this new season, what do you think is some advice you have for me as I'm going into this new season? And he pauses, and he says, I think you know the answer to that question. What do you think you need? And I told myself two things. I said, number one is don't disconnect yourself from church because in our worlds, I think a lot of times we've experienced things that are ideal, not ideal. But I'm like, don't necessarily disconnect yourself. But I said, number two is what you start, make sure you finish. And all my life, I've got a short attention span. And that's good. That's a strength. But, in many ways, it's also been hard to keep myself committed to something. And the thing I've learned is that you can grow. And the other thing, too, is I'm not naturally a very structured person. I am a very spontaneous person, very go with the flow thing. But what I've learned is that with time, if you have an intention, you can actually grow in areas. And I've actually been growing. And recently I had somebody give me a compliment. They said, wow, you're such an organized person. And I'm like, okay, so I've learned that you can grow. And I've also learned that there's spaces to grow. Yeah.
Well, Karol and I both know you as a good friend, but we also know you as a podcaster. But what is it like to be a podcaster, and how do you prepare yourself for an interview?
Great question. So I think somebody once asked me, you want to be a communicator. What does communicating have to do with podcasting? I said, podcasting is a genre of communication. And so the way I look at it is that with what we do is I love being a podcaster because in many ways it's an avenue to communicate. Recently, a few days ago, I was with a group of podcasters, and as I was with them, it was so interesting to kind of observe in what ways we were similar. And one commonality I saw between everybody is that everybody was interested in one another. And so as a podcaster, I think one thing is I'm somebody that's very interested. And so one thing that's amazing is in a natural everyday conversation, I'm interested in you, I'm interested in you, I'm interested in the next person. What amazing thing to be interested in somebody and then having that conversation broadcasted to other people and other people being impacted by that. So I think that deeply moves me. I think it's also kind of cool to get your foot into something entrepreneurial and say, I'm not only an entrepreneur as far as like name, but I'm actually doing something. And so I think I really enjoy that.
Who specifically inspired you to start podcasting?
Ooh, I don't think there was a specific person as much as there was a moment. And the moment was that I had been in a traditional church context in ministry. And there was this one moment where I was driving from my mom's house, she lives an hour away from where I live. And at like 5 a.m, I'm driving and all of a sudden I'm like, okay, so I want to impact people above and beyond a space of 4 walls. But how do I do that? And then I thought to myself, I actually listen to a lot of podcasts. So then that thought came to my mind. And then the next thought came, well, there seems to be a disconnection between Sunday and the rest of the week. And then the next thing is when people that are spiritual look people that are achievers, they hate them. I feel that achievers in a lot of Christian films, at least my context, are usually the villains. And then people that are successful look down on spiritual people because they look down on them as lazy people. And so is it possible to see the intersection between these two worlds? And so is it more of a person as much as a moment?
Yeah, I definitely see that in your life. You are a bridge builder. I see that a lot. Now, being that person and being in this role, have you seen obstacles that you've had to face, even the recent years that you've done this?
Yeah, as a bridge builder, I think in different ways, I think at the core of everything, I've always gone for the outsider. As a second grader, I remember befriending this kid by the name of Brian, and Brian was from Canada and nobody wanted to talk to him. I remember when I was in 12th grade, I befriended an international student from Vietnam. His name was Tyne, and his English was broken, and we just became really good friends. I remember in college, I befriended another friend from Saudi Arabia who was blind. And so I've always been interested in the other. And so I think the biggest thing is that what's hard is that sometimes you want to connect the humanity of people with one another, but sometimes in that process, people can't see beyond the labels they've put on that humanity.
Yeah, very cool. Have you, because we're talking about your podcast life, have you ever considered giving up?
I've had the thought, I've had the feeling of giving up tons of times, but I think what keeps me going is I even at a certain level, I lost a really good friend because they didn't believe in what I was doing, which is unfortunate. And I think that there's things like that. There's moments in which you tell yourself, is anyone listening? I remember this one time I all of a sudden got this message from a teacher. It says, I love hearing your messages. They're always inspirational. And so I remember there's moments in which you all of a sudden get things, but you don't get that on a constant basis. And then there's moments where there's some episodes that have had tons of email feedback, which has been amazing. So it's a journey of sometimes, is anyone listening? Or at times, did this really hit? Is that like really what people are looking for? Or along the lines of like looking at the overwhelm of all the work, is it worth it in the long run? And also people around you very close saying, hey, you know, let's go do this or go do that, and having to say, I can't do that. No. So I think that's been the most difficult part, but I've never actually given up. You know, to this day, we've had an episode every single Monday. But yeah, definitely.
Josh, I'm sure for you, it's so cool to be able to be at this moment of having 100 episodes and being able to reflect on the ways that you've been able to impact and really speak into some very successful, very high-profile leaders.
Yeah.
And something that you've talked about a couple times that we'd like to explore a little bit more today is this idea that with success comes failure. And that's something that is eminent in any endeavor. So as a leader, how has failure played into your development, even with this podcast?
Yeah, I think that kind of being able to be in tune with trends and going like, okay, I guess there's something off with this episode. Why aren't people listening to this episode as much as that episode? Or at times, reaching out to a potential guest and having them say no. Okay, well, what can I do differently, or why did they potentially say no? Also along the lines of, this week of editing was a lot harder than last time. Why was that? This interview went this direction. What could have been done better? So there's definitely been a lot of introspection as far as things go, like those failures along the way. And I think that with that has just been a sense of growth along the way and saying, okay, you really I'm going to be completely honest with you. Podcasting is not a job journey that you get rich overnight. There's this one podcaster, his name is John Lee Dumas. He's the host of this thing called Entrepreneur on Fire. It's a podcast that comes out every single day, 7 days a week, 30-minute podcast every single day. And he didn't make money until 9 months in. And 9 months in, he actually, as he's doing this, and this is with somebody that by that time had something like tons of episodes, like hundreds of episodes. So he didn't make money till 9 months in. And so I think it's something that you don't get overnight. And so it's just that process of okay, well, got to put in the work, what's the long-term goal? What's the long-term, there's people that aren't seeing the results just yet, but then all of a sudden you also celebrate the small victories. Oh my goodness, that person said yes, that probably wouldn't have said yes a few months ago. Or that person's reaching out to me now. And before a few months ago, nobody reached out to me to pitch guests. And so it's just that constant journey in that. Yeah.
I think you as a person, you just uphold this really neat tension of being an achiever and being someone that's very driven, and yet you have this balance to you that you are so relational and you prioritize that. And so along the lines of that, if you thinking about just this specific circumstance in your podcast, if you could have anybody from throughout history to just sit and interview and be with, who would you choose?
That's such a good question, because there's so much people that just come to my mind that come to just memory. But I think as I look through it all, I think there's people like Winston Churchill, there's Abraham Lincoln. I think if I had to choose one, I'd probably lean towards maybe Abraham Lincoln, even though there's probably tons of other people that I'm it'd be so interesting to sit with David, from the Bible. I think that'd be interesting. I think it'd be interesting to sit down with Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. I think my answer is Abraham Lincoln, and the reason why is I think that I'm reading this book called Hypomanic Drive. It's really interesting. I think I told you about it. And what's interesting is the whole book, it talks about how there's a connection between crazy and success. And most people that are successful are actually usually seen as crazy by a lot of people. Whether it be their habits, they wake up super early. Whether it be their habits, they say no to a lot of things. Whether it be their habits of just the way they carry themselves, or the way they dress, or the way they speak. And so if you look at most presidents, they would actually be diagnosed with some kind of sense of craziness. And that includes Abraham Lincoln. So how are you with this sense of difference, but able to do such a dynamic impact? And that fascinates me.
Outside of the podcast, who would you just sit down and want to have coffee with? Anyone in history. Anyone in history.
I don't think this is as much, this is probably going to seem like a cop-out, but I think I've come to such a place where I love meeting with successful people, but I love to have a cup of coffee with the everyday person. Give me a small like high school student, give me an elderly person, give me somebody that's achieved. I think one of my philosophies in life I learned one time from a teacher. Her name is Professor Lindsay Scott. Remember, first year at Cal State Northridge. She said, everybody is a student and everyone is a teacher. And so if I'm having a cup of coffee with somebody, there's something that they can teach me about relationships, something they can teach me about success, something that they're amazing at, even if it's not a business or anything like that.
Yeah, for sure. Now, when you are getting ready, you've decided who you're going to interview.
Yeah.
How do you, like, spiritually, emotionally, how do you get ready, aside of, like, the logistical aspect of your podcast?
Usually I try to... I think all of us have a gift. Some of us, we are insanely... The moment we enter a room, everybody's like, okay, it's about to be lit. Party time. There's others that the moment we enter a room, there's just peace. And I think all of us, we have that. So I think one is just, I try to be really focused and honed in. And if, like, for instance, yesterday, even getting ready for this, I was telling Mark earlier, I really wanted to do some things last night. I have a to-do list of like 50,000 things. I told myself, I'm just going to rest, and just trust in God. And I think in that sense, just have a sense of, okay, you're going to be in a sense of a space where you can give a lot. And so one of the things too is there are seasons where I can't always do it, but I just have a Sabbath. And so I think having a Sabbath continually once a week, even though there's weeks I pull in 70 hours of work, which is a lot. I think that just having that rhythm has helped a lot.
Yeah, that's awesome. Now, if because you've been doing this for such a long time, what has stood up to you like a lot? Or a person? A person. So I think there's been several moments. I think one time was one of the most impactful of all-time moments was actually for this very, very podcast, the intersection of success and spirituality. I have to, and the first one of the first episodes I ever did was with this rabbi by the name of Rabbi Laura Geller. I don't know if any of you two heard it, but what was fascinating was that I'm sitting with this woman who at some point she was one of the first ever rabbis in the history of her tradition, and I go and I'm talking with her and I'm like, how on earth did you not become bitter at the men and women that did not want you to be a rabbi? And she pauses and gives me one of the most impactful questions I've ever had in my life. She says, "What do you think of Mark?" No, I'm kidding. She says, "What's the invitation here?" I asked myself the question, what's the invitation here? And in my life, there's been different things that have got me bitter, that have got me frustrated, but what's the invitation here? Another thing is, for the Spanish podcast, I interviewed this individual by the name of Hector Hermosillo. He's, at some point, he was the best known guitarist in Mexico. By the age of like 21, he's toured with like different artists that are very well known. But I get to his house. I've never met the guy. And there's his wife, there's his manager, there he is, and on the table is food. And I go inside, and before we start our interview, he's like, do you have time? How are you on time? And I'm like, yeah, I'm good. And he's like, before we start, I just simply like to get to know you. And so we just talk for an hour. So cool. And without being somebody that's very old, married, or with all the labels that will put you in a position of prestige, he just wants to get to know me. And that really just stood out to me. Mm-hmm. That's awesome.
Josh, we got a lot of different things that we want to cover today, but I think one of the biggest priorities in doing this 100th episode is just to get to know you as a person more fully for us as your listeners. So anyone who's spent any sort of time with you, any considerable amount of time with you, it's almost a guarantee within the first, I would say 10 minutes, some would say 30 seconds, that you'll raise this question that goes something like this. Do you know your Myers-Briggs? or what's your strengths finder? Something along those lines. Mm-hmm. But as a leader, as someone, or a friend even, what do you think, what are the advantages or what are the strengths of being able to be self-aware of maybe your Myers-Briggs, and how does that impact you as a person?
Yeah, there are three things that come to mind. The very first thing that comes to my mind is in my own journey in school, I think the gifts that are time and time again acknowledged are the people in sports and the people that have the greatest looks. These are the people that are on the top of the pedestal, whether it be by students or whether it be by teachers. And if you're like a super straight A person as well. And there's different groups. I never was in straight A. I never was the best at sports. And I never ever, I guess, like had the most amazing like looks or whatever. But even though I do feel good about myself. But anyways, I remember always being overlooked. And the moment that I tapped into StrengthsFinder, I'm like, oh my goodness, like I am good at that. Like that is right. Like I am a good listener, or like I am a good communicator, or like I do analyze, or I am strategic. And so I think that just knowing that helped me say, you're affirmed in the gifts that God has given you. And I think that's powerful, to affirm your kids, to affirm your employees, to affirm people around your life. Second is to understand people. Sometimes, for instance, one thing is, this is very practical, but people talk about the love languages. If I show love to people through words, but somebody shows it more through actions, and throughout life, I'm just showing it with words, but not like practical actions, like doing errands or like washing dishes or things like that, that person's not going to feel loved. They're going to say so much for your bluff. And versus me, I think I'm showing them love. And so I think that it's very important to know where people are coming from. And I think number 3 is that whatever organization you do, whatever project you do, it's going to reflect who you are. And so right now that you are watching this, you are seeing this, you are living within my imagination. Because this is a manifestation of who I am. And so when you enter a church, you're living an outward expression of who that pastor visionary is. And so it's going to reflect your strengths and your weaknesses. And so I think being self-aware of that is helpful.
Okay. In one word, no elaborating. No. In one word, describe yourself.
Just one word?
One word.
Catalyst.
Next question.
All right. So obviously podcasting is not the only thing you do. And aside of work, aside of everything else you do and tasks and everything, who are you? Like, what do you do?
Okay.
Like, not what you do. Who is Josh?
Okay. Josh is working is a big part of my life. But
I know.
but apart from work, I think there's a strand of 3 people that are most important people in my life. There's my best friend, Dorian. There's these 2 youth that were at my old church that I love them like family. And there's my own family. And so usually those are people I'll probably be spending time with, whether it's watching a movie, whether hanging out, whether going out to eat with them, whether it be hiking, whether it be going to do something together. So I think a good span of my time is spent with them because they're a priority and they got a big place in my heart. I also love reading. I love reading so much. I love music. I'm not the best musician. So in order to rest, one thing, I'll just get into my room sometimes and just play the acoustic guitar and have some fun, spontaneously sing. I also love movies and I love the NBA.
We'll get to that.
Don't you worry.
I'm reading a book by Chris Voss right now, and he explains that it's always really cool to let people know up front certain information. Now, if someone were meeting you for the first time, what would they need to know, or what would you like them to know up front about who you are so that they get you?
Sure. I would say one thing that up front is just I'm a very sensitive person. And that's got its strengths and weaknesses. I think one is I've literally been in spaces where for the first 8 interviews I ever did for this show, the guests at some point cried. And so I'm very sensitive to people and to who they are, and also just sensitive as far as like things that come. But with time, I've gotten stronger in that.
Josh, again, you've already mentioned it, but it doesn't take any considerable amount of time if you are a friend of yours. You love movies.
I love movies so much,
and I'm sure this is a hard question, but maybe you have this already off the cuff. But we're gonna give you top 3 movies.
Top 3.
Yeah. Top 3 movies.
I
thought we were gonna go to top 5.
Sorry, this is a surprise.
Okay, so top 3. Not in this order, but top 3 movies I like. One of them is I think it's called. It's the second of the
Passion
Huntsman.
of the Christ.
The Passion of the Christ.
That one.
No, the Huntsman. The Winter's War. I love that movie so much. For some reason,
Okay.
I just absolutely love that movie. It's so creative, imaginative. Second one, I love August Rush a lot, so that's a good movie. That's probably my top 5. But and oh man, you guys are making out. Oh, The Count of Monte Cristo. It's my favorite novel of all time. Favorite movie.
Okay.
Too.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Now, you've been raised by a single mother, right? How has that shaped who you are?
Yeah, so I grew up in an interesting context because I grew up with the ability. My dad was financially always there, but as far as presently, not all the time. So I think the experience of that was interesting because I think it wasn't so much the inside as far as the outside. I felt I could see her overlooked at church. You know, it's interesting when you step into a church and they're talking about marriage and marriage ministry when there's a single mom there. It's kind of hard when you're a kid and on Father's Day, all the kids in the kids ministry are giving their dads gifts, and you go and you create a gift because it's the thing in your classroom, and you go into the service and your dad's not there. So you have to give it to somebody else at the church. So I think that, if anything, that's shaped me to be all the more empathetic. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm always looking for the outsider. And in the case, I thought at some points she was the outsider.
How does that change how you do ministry now?
I think, if anything, it just makes me lean in definitely even more to empathy and definitely more into when I am in tune with other people. I'm really insanely big on mentorship. And so if you're a girl and you don't have a mentor, I'll try to see if I could connect you with somebody. And if you don't have a mentor and you're younger than me, then there's a heart for me that at some level I want to make myself available to my capacities.
That's awesome. Now, I have to ask you this question.
She's been dying.
Yeah, I really do, because it is pressing, and especially for your situation. What is your view on women in ministry?
Women in ministry? I believe that when we don't hear women, we miss a part of God. And so when we don't hear the voice of women, when we don't see the women's impact in ministry or in society, we're missing a piece of God. And so I believe in female pastors. I believe in females and leaders. I believe that it's a very complex issue as far as with things going forward. But I believe that God has empowered, God has made women with the abilities to lead and also to lead other people. So
That's really good. Now, shifting gears a little bit.
Yeah.
You were raised by who? What is your culture? What is your background?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
So I grew up as a second generation of, my mom's from El Salvador, my dad's from Guatemala. And
Lots of pupusas.
yeah, so lots of pupusas, tamales. My mom learned how to cook a lot of Mexican food, American food, Italian food, everything, because my dad wanted everything, I guess, when they were married. So early on, she learned a lot. Every Christmas to this day, we still have tamales, so it's really good stuff. But it was really interesting being a bicultural kid within America because, I remember this one time, and it's really interesting because in kindergarten or first grade or second grade, being the only Hispanic among a lot of people that were predominantly white, also having my mom speak to me in Spanish, I'm like, Mom, I have a crush on that girl right there. Why are you talking to me in Spanish? And so it's like that kind of thing, and which long term, like, I'm appreciative for that. And then also, different things that just because of her cultural experience, you just didn't get. Like one of them, it's still vivid in my memory as a fifth grader. I remember we had to do like Secret Santa. The guy that I got, he wanted lead pencils. So we're at the supermarket and I'm like, Mom, I need to buy these lead pencils. It's for school. And she's like, no te voy a comprar eso, which means I'm not going to buy you that. Like, you got to be kidding me. Like, I'm your mom and I don't want to buy you that. And so what I literally did was I wrapped a pencil of my own and gave it to him because I didn't have anything to give, and I got in trouble by the teacher. I remember in 7th grade, there was this one moment where we had to do a cultural project, and there was a moment where we had to give a story for the cultural project of our parents' childhood. And I asked my mom, hey, so give me a story of your childhood. And she's like, well, my dad growing up, like he would grow coffee. And so like, Mom, I need a story. And she's like, yeah, so growing up, he'd like do coffee. And so then I go and I do my presentation and it comes to the story part. And I'm like, yeah, so my grandfather, he would do coffee. And I think I got like a C- on that project because I didn't have a story. And so I think if anything, there's been sense of like that disconnect, but the beauty of it all is that I think you get to see the amazing gifts of American culture, the amazing gifts of Latino culture, and bring those gifts to one another. And also, I think the amazing thing is you get to understand different people. I think there's pieces of God in Latin culture that maybe are not seen in American culture, and pieces of vice versa. And so that's amazing. And I think also that you get to understand people, get to have a far greater reach, and it's just amazing in that sense.
I hope since then you've heard some type of story of your background, of your grandparents of some sort.
I did. I think if anything, being empathetic is that I think my mom grew up in Central America during the Civil War. And so it wasn't necessarily the prettiest things. Like there'd be days where she'd walk outside of her house and there was dead bodies. And so it was just a very not ideal. But I definitely eventually did get a story though.
Which is probably why she probably wanted to forget all of that and not share that at such a young age. Now, being Hispanic and living here in the States, have you ever felt inferior in any way? And if not, or if so, how has someone or something shaped that view?
It's really, really, really interesting. I think that this is going to sound like insane, but one thing that I think exists within Latino culture, I think it sits with all different cultures of people of color, is I think there's colorism. I think that there's a notch of if you marry a white person, you're doing something great for your race and you're moving up the ladder of social status. And also in the sense that particularly in a context where at times, you don't see representation on films, and the few representations that you get, that's disheartening. But also, I think just in different contexts where there's people in your life that, for some reason or another, especially in Latin culture, that with subtle things gets you, even people closest to you, to look down on your color because it's maybe not the best thing. And so I think that's been something that definitely I've dealt with. And I think one of the most liberating moments was with my pastor, talking and conversing. And I'm trying to make the story short, but we had finished an interview for this show. And at the end of the interview, I said, like, I don't know, for some reason, I hate it when people like gently touch my shoulder or just give me a gentle touch because I feel it's not genuine. I don't know. And we started talking. And I think by the end of our conversation, I was crying. And he's like, and I started talking about different things about my life. I'm like, well, there's a fact that I'm brown. There's a fact that I failed at this or I lost that. And with every single situation, he was painting to me what Jesus would say to that. And I think that was one of the most liberating, moving things I've ever experienced. And so there's definitely been moments,
Those types of conversations are so important to have, especially in a circle with friends and somebody. I didn't grow up in a bilingual home. I grew up in a pretty different context than Southern California. I grew up in Colorado, but mixed with 4 years of Spanish in high school, and then getting to be friends with you and other friends. And
we talk in Spanish sometimes. It's so fun. It's so fun.
Josh helps me with my Spanish.
Cool.
And recently you've had some opportunities to be able to begin to explore new opportunities podcasting in Spanish. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so this is insanely exciting. Recently, as far as February of 2018, we launched the first ever podcast for the network of Enlace, which is the largest Christian television network in the world. And it's the first ever, and I think it's been an amazing experience. I have never, ever cried in an English podcast, which is crazy. I've cried twice in Spanish. one of the interviews was with this guy by the name of Sixto Porras, all the way in Costa Rica. And there was just something, I read the foreword of his book. Somebody wrote the foreword of one of his newest books and said, every time I'm with this guy, I feel the fragrance of God's Spirit. And what's crazy is I felt that in our interview. Wow. Like, literally, this guy loves God. Like, he believes in what he's saying. And so there's this point where I asked him the question, well, to date, what's been your greatest spiritual experience? He says one time he was in Israel, and all of a sudden, as he was in Israel, he had this moment where the Sea of Galilee, the sun was hitting the water, and he's right there. And in this moment, he wanted to record it on his phone or camera, and the battery was out, and so he couldn't. And he felt God's gentle whisper tell him, don't worry, from this day forward, every day will be Sea of Galilee for you. And he says, to this day forward, every day has been. And at the end, I asked, well, what do you want your legacy to be? That's the question I ask everybody. And he goes and he says, well, today, I can say I've lived as a faithful husband, as a father. If God were to take me today, I'd have no regrets. I'm like, how many people can say I would have no regrets? Like, it's incredible. And so just in our interaction, like, it was just so moving. And another one was with this pastor. His name is Joel Lopez. He grew up in a context with every single one of his siblings had different dads. And he became a gangster by the age of 12. But there was this moving moment where God at the age of 12 just took him. It was crazy. Great story.
That's really cool. Now, I know for me, I didn't grow up just like you, but I speak both languages as well. Now, when I'm thinking in English. I speak most of my life in English.
Yeah.
Of course, like we work in ministry and we do Spanish as well. Now, because you have both worlds right now, you're balancing. Which one do you prefer?
That's so interesting. I think I love both, but I have a slight edge of Spanish. There's something very particular about. Long story short, I think one time I heard this guy. His name is Albert Tate, and he's a great speaker locally. Where to us, me and Mark, and this one event we were together at, he was talking about this one moment when he was a little kid that he was in an African American church, and when people were happy, they'd start dancing. But then the moment that he started being in this choir at the school. One day they won this award, and he wanted to jump up and dance. He looked around, and the kids around him weren't dancing or excited jumping up. They were just clapping. And so I think he points that as a moment that marked him. And so years later, just recently, he says that he was in South Africa, and this one woman takes him by the hand and invites him to dance during a worship service. And he says, I reconnected with my roots. And so being in the Spanish world, I feel that I've reconnected with my roots.
For sure. That's cool. Have you ever wanted to or are planning to learn a different language?
I've learned French before.
Really cool.
Yeah.
Do you remember any of it?
That's the key.
Yeah.
J'ai oublié.
Yeah, cool. Now, would you encourage other people to learn a different language?
Yeah, my dad knows, my dad is, oh my goodness, he knows 6 languages.
Oh,
dang.
He knows Tagalog because he's been a nurse his whole life. He knows, recently, I think he was learning German. He also Hebrew, and he's just out there. But and that's one of his favorite pastimes. So, yeah, I think learning languages is great because you connect with people in new ways and also get to have more grace for those that are learning your language.
And more food.
Yes, come on. That's so
really,
good. That's so good. So good.
That's the benefit.
Right.
Hey, so we are at halftime of episode 100, and for our halftime break, Josh, we have some rapid fire questions.
Oh, come on, let's do it.
Share with you. And so these are just kind of off the cuff, whatever responses that come up to your mind initially. But what do you do for fun? If you had a Friday night free, what do you do?
Probably
for
go
fun?
watch a movie.
Go watch a movie.
Yeah.
Do you have Movie Pass?
I don't. I was gonna get that.
Oh, that's, I'm surprised.
Costco.
Yeah,
Oh,
they got
really?
a deal right now.
Yes. Oh, sorry. No,
What are we talking about?
commercial.
If you could be pursuing any alternate career right now besides what you're doing currently, what would that be?
So outside of, I think it would just always be something along the sense of communications. So whether it be storytelling, movie telling, or even marketing.
Radio broadcaster.
Yeah.
Game announcer. Ooh.
That'd be amazing.
NBA announcer. Okay.
That'd be amazing.
It's late and you're hungry. Where do you go for a snack, or what do you cook?
Probably some cereal.
Boring.
Sorry.
Are we talking like
Pupusas.
Go-to.
right? You had all this good food.
Yeah.
Are we talking like frosted mini wheats, fruity pebbles? Are you going honey bunches of oats, Cheerios?
No, I'm obsessed with dried cranberries, so it'd be something with dried cranberries.
Yum.
Yeah.
Very good. That's good. Who's your celebrity lookalike?
Oh, Julio Zavala. I don't know if you guys ever.
No.
He's a Hispanic comedian.
Okay, now we're all gonna Google
Yeah.
Julio Zavala. Okay. Do you meal prep or do you figure out what you're gonna eat Sunday nights or the week before?
I try to be intentional. I'm not the best all the time at that, but it's like back and forth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Favorite comic book hero or favorite comic
X-Men.
hero?
I love X-Men.
Anyone specific?
Wolverine.
Okay.
Hugh Jackman won me over.
Yes.
Nice.
Yes.
Greatest Showman.
Yeah. Oh,
That was incredible. That was incredible.
Incredible.
I cried at that one. Yeah.
start singing. I'm not a singer, and I'll start singing. Josh, favorite drink, coffee at
oh my
Starbucks. What's
goodness.
your favorite drink?
I'd probably chai vanilla latte.
Okay.
Yeah.
Iced or hot?
Ice.
Large
Back
or
and
small?
forth. Large.
Trenta?
In-N-Out or Five Guys?
In and out.
Hesitate. Do you eat ice cream on rainy days?
I've not done, but I'll probably do it for the next one. Probably be a peach ice cream. I love peach.
Ooh.
It doesn't rain very much out here
No,
anyways.
it's like all 2 days that it's
So y'all know we're in Los Angeles,
Yeah.
California. Specifically right now, Long Beach, which is
we're
fun.
in Long Beach.
Yeah.
Yeah, Long Beach.
Yeah.
We were really excited about
Yeah.
this question. This might be the most important question of the day.
This is what you get to take away. Yeah.
Make or break. Top 3 NBA players of all time.
Oh man. Michael Jordan, hands down. Magic Johnson and Kobe Bryant. Top 3.
Of course,
That was quick.
There's 2 Lakers
Yeah.
in this conversation. now we're talking about.
I love Steph Curry, but he hasn't
California.
proved himself just yet.
Not
but,
yet.
Yeah. But I love
Maybe
him.
if we ask this question in 10 years.
Yep.
Yeah. Tough
we'll be cracking
audience.
that. Yeah. Hey, so we're gonna shift into something that you've explored a little bit on some of your shows and some of your interviews, but we'd love to hear your perspective on just kind of this conversation about millennials and different
yes.
generations. And, but we want to bring this up today, just because I think it's really important. One, if you are a millennial, just to become more aware of just different cultural trends and how that's really influenced and shaped our culture. But then also, especially for the different leaders and influencers that do listen to your show.
Yeah.
So important to be aware and to be really considering the ways that the millennials are viewing the world, that are pursuing life. And so you just being as an incredibly observant person, you're very keen on awareness. And so
We talk about this so
it's
much.
true. It's
Yeah.
true. And I think that's such a gift that you offer
you.
offer people. But as a millennial yourself, what do you think are some of the greatest strengths that this generation contributes to our current society?
I think there's several. I think one of the things is that most millennials are on the brink of so much dysfunction in families. So much families growing up with single mothers, divorce, with different things where there wasn't stability at home. And so I think there's a choice or an opportunity to make a different story in that sense. There's also a lot of creativity and entrepreneurialism. Yes, we have a short attention span, but I think we could channel those things in new ways and new creative and innovation. I also think that we're very creative. We're very much into at some level, beyond success, trying to do things well. So there's a lot of millennials that, for instance, work at home and things like that. And so I think that there's definitely I think some of the weaknesses is that sometimes we could be a little bit too edgy. I think we want to change things, but sometimes there's things that we want to change that maybe necessarily don't need change. I think sometimes we just lack humility to listen. I think that a lot of older generations can give us a lot of wisdom. And I also think that sometimes we are so much into the image. You know, how much likes did I get? You know, who's following me? How many people are following me? And you know, I think there's some validity to that. But at the end of the day, are you going to actually put in the work? I can care less if you have 50,000 likes. If your bank account is like empty, then like, was it really, you know, substantial? You know, yeah. You
named a lot of important realities about millennials and about what it means to be a millennial, but also to become more aware. An idea that I think is important. There's kind of been this shift where modernity had this concept that I think, therefore I am, right? It was a lot of empirical knowledge and it was very cerebral, to where this shift in postmodernity and thus for millennials, it's I feel. and therefore I am. Why is it important as a leader to be aware of this shift?
I think that if you understand someone, that impacts the capacity of your ability to communicate to them. And so if I have, when I'm writing my emails to guests that I want to know this person so well that people that are closest to them I've interviewed, different things that they're passionate about, that I speak into that. When I'm speaking to an audience, there's different things that will resonate more. And so if you understand that there's postmodernistic effect in the people you're leading, that'll help you lead them more effectively.
Josh, I think you have a really unique role in both your previous experiences, but then your current experiences that you're leading a lot of different generations. That you've led youth and you've led people that are younger than you, but you're also leading people that are much older than you and that maybe even have more experience than you. As a leader, what do you think is the greatest gift that you can offer to those that you lead, maybe even cross-generationally?
Expand on that a little more.
Just thinking about the ways that you're aware of different cultural trends specific to different generations. What do you think is something that you can do or prioritize maybe as a leader that is able to transcend these, I guess, generational barriers that sometimes come up for some leaders?
I think some of the greatest strengths and weaknesses is in our labels. Because if you understand the millennials and millennials, you see some trends, that's helpful at a certain level. But if you want to influence them, then you have to get that knowledge, but then toss it in the moment. Go like, how can I connect with this human being?
Yeah, that's so good. Shifting gears a little bit, but still kind of in this conversation. You're involved in a couple of different circles right now in life, and just really being able to explore things even beyond podcasting. And I think it really enhances your podcasting experience. But, would you speak a little bit about your current involvement with just kind of this model of trying to be more involved in serving a demographic like millennials?
Absolutely. So currently, Mark and I, we serve at a church, and that's a very, very innovative church. And one of the things that's very great about there is that I think on an everyday basis, I think I've run in with people that are quote unquote celebrities and people that are not. But one thing that I've noticed is that people don't, at the end of the day, celebrities aren't that, I'm not too drawn to the celebrity part of a person. I'm drawn to the humanity of a person. And so it's constantly pushed me towards that movement of humanity. And also, I think in that sense, be able to, when I notice things or notice the way I'm communicating things and notice on a one-on-one basis if that's not working, which that gives me more opportunities to do so, then that helps me when I'm in a different space. So I think different things are connected. And I think there's also even greater moments. Yesterday, I had this one moment with somebody where this one old lady, she like pauses at some point and she's like, was that you that just spoke or something along the lines of that? And I'm like, yeah. And she's like, what are your dreams with that voice of yours? And I said, well, I have 2 internet radio shows. And incessantly to explain it to her, because podcasting, I'm like, internet radio shows.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And so she pauses and she's like, and I said one of them was the Christian Television Network in Spanish and the other one's in English, and you can hear in different places. She just pauses and she was like teary-eyed and she's like, that's good. It'd be a waste for you to waste that gift. And so it's crazy that you get moments like that. Yeah. And I think that provides for more moments like that.
Yeah. You've talked a lot about this idea in other interviews, but just being able to be a dynamic person, feeling like you have a call to pastoral ministry, that's something that God specifically placed on your life. And yet right now that's kind of taking shape in different ways. Yeah. How has your current role allowed you to explore that calling more fully?
I think in 2 ways. I think one is with the podcast is I feel that there are moments in which I get to be a pastor with my guest. Recently for a Spanish podcast, a pastor of a really, really well-known church at the end of our interview paused and said, thank you for asking me those questions, because I've never asked those questions myself.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So there's moments like that. There's also moments where you get to kind of continually see and appreciate the different expressions of church. I think as I'm in the current model I'm in, I get to see like, oh, okay, this is the value of this, or these are places we can continually grow in. Yeah.
That's really good. Now, you've worked in or served as well in different types of traditional roles in leadership and pastoralship. Can you enlighten us a little bit about that? How was that experience for you? I know you're not currently doing much of that now, but you have. And what are, the pros, the cons, what you liked about it, what you learned?
Yeah. So I learned quite a bit. I think, and I've worked with different tons and different organizations. But I think the biggest thing, and this one goes back to the whole millennial thing, is millennials can kind of care less about your title. I'm sorry. You're a CEO. Okay, screw it. That's like the attitude. Or like, okay, you're like Dr. So-and-so. Okay, at the end of the day, you're going to follow people that embody what they're trying to tell you to do.
For sure.
And so what I've learned time and time again is, as I've seen certain people lead successfully or unsuccessfully in different organizations, what's been common as they've led is not only are they there, but they're leading at the front of the pack. So the general that's the most effective sometimes is that Napoleon that's there in front of everybody, charging and making sure that everybody sees them in that, embodying that.
Do you see yourself in the future, at least in what the traditional aspect of a pastor is?
I'm actually not close to that, but I don't see myself in that currently, but I'm not close to that. I think that my calling is definitely to be a pastor. It's been affirmed, and there's no doubt in my mind, but I think it really depends on a lot of factors. I think it depends on what God leads me in a certain part of my life. I think a lot to who I marry, too. And just different factors. So I think it really depends on quite a few things.
We both have experienced working in Hispanic culture and the Hispanic scene. And, the aspect of what serving is like, how a pastor is viewed in that scene.
Yeah.
How has that been an experience, whether good or bad, in your life?
Yeah. So I went to APU, which is where I graduated for seminary. And I remember one of the most moving moments was like, I remember being in class and there's this one moment where we learned about the priesthood of all believers. And I'm not gonna lie, for a moment, I was kind of like struck by that because my whole identity had been wrapped around, you're a pastor, you're God's anointed, you're somebody special. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, so I'm like not that special anymore. And so I think that hit me. And I think part of that had been coming from a Pentecostal background. And I think also specifically from a Hispanic background where we sometimes have elevated our leaders to such an extent where they're untouchable. And I felt that way. And so all of a sudden that put me no, I think there's something more dynamic. There's a greater story. There's a greater vibrancy here than we've known. And so I think that's one thing. I think another thing too is sometimes we could tend to be very authoritative and beyond the dynamic of I'm going to lead from where I'm at, lead from a sense of just titles and those kind of echelons, which there's a space for that. And so, but the positive things is that I think I love my Hispanic roots. I love my Hispanic heritage. And I think, like I was saying, I think there's just something also just so warm about Hispanic people, so passionate, and a lot of pastors and people that have great convictions that really, really want to do well in the world.
Yeah, that's really good. Now, we're about to close, and it's been, I think, enlightening for both of us to hear some stuff that we wouldn't have heard about you outside of this context. But if there's something or anything heavy in your heart or that you feel that your audience needs to hear or is important to you right now in your life, whether big or small, what is that?
So I've got two. I love that question. By the way, you guys have been amazing. I think one is... one of the most moving things I ever heard on an interview was with this guy by the name of Ken Coleman. And his whole story is that for a long time, he was an entrepreneur selling cell phone equipment. And he had this radio show as well, which I guess it hadn't got as much traction at the moment, but he kept working on it. And one day he interviewed a CEO on a controversial topic that went number one, and overnight he was on CNN and everywhere. And so that launched his platform. And he says it's important to be doing the right thing with the right people, and then your right time will come. And so wherever you're at, whether you're starting something, whether you ultimately want to do something, understand that it's a constant grind and hustle that, with the Spanish podcast, which is incredible, at the right place, at the right time, and the right time came. And I think that that's important. I think another thing to know too is that not everything is as it seems. The people that sometimes are influencing or our social media sphere with what we've kind of projected to the world that we're successful or this, sometimes things are, underneath the surface, there's entrepreneurs out there that are saying, hey, I'm at the top of the world, but you meet them and they're broke, And so the thing is to understand is that if you really have a dream in life that you want to do, that you really want to impact people or become a millionaire or whatever it might be, hopefully you're aligned to where God wants you to be, is that understand it's going to take hard work. It's going to take hustle. It's going to take you probably even been seen weird by people. It's going to probably be made fun of by people, not misunderstood. But at the end of the day, if you are faithful and you persevere, you'll see God take you far above in what you can imagine. And the other thing, too, that's really interesting that I also learned from Ken Coleman is there's 3 different seasons in our life. Number 1 is building. This is where the season I think I'm still in is you're building. Next is you're sustaining what you've built. And after sustaining, you give back. And I think that that's very, very important. And to just look at the lifespan of your own self, It's really good. So thank you guys all. Thank you, Mark.
Oh, Josh, this was so much fun.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us here.
I love these two, and I admire them. They're great listeners, great people, and also too, I think I've met so many people, and I think one of the things is sometimes when I'm listening to people, I'm like, I think what you just need is just good friends. And so I'm very thankful for you too. And if you've been listening to this episode and been following us for 100 episodes or wherever you followed us, thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you for the love, the feedback, for the support. It means a lot. Whether you just listen to one episode or whether you've been binging on them, thank you so much. Grace and peace be with you all. Thanks again for listening to the Intersection of Success and Spirituality podcast. Thank you, guys.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh. Shalom.